Welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham, and special guest, our technology editor at SportsPro Media, Steve McCaskill. Now, Steve, it is certainly something Nick and I would have talked about anyways, given, what happened last night. But given you're the only person, properly English, I would just sort of, instant feedback. How are you feeling?
Not great. It's a bit better than it was 3 years ago. I feel like that's the tournament we've left on the table, I think, the Euro 2020. So last night, at least we have the consolation of being beaten by comfortably the best team in the tournament. There were no real regrets there. It was a strange route to the final. But yeah, still hurts. I know Nick jokes a lot about all the sports and teams I follow, but there's nothing more I want in sport than an England major tournament victory, and it's just this close again. But we move, and it's gonna come home from your homeland in 2026, Chris.
Well, I mean, seeing some of the highlights, I don't know if they're going to pull the World Cup. I saw highlights of the Colombia-Argentina fans. There's people crawling through air conditioning vents to get into the stadium without tickets. Like, I don't know. There might be some concerns about the World Cup in 2026.
That's what they needed this one to get under they need to get this one under their belts first, right? To make sure they realize how crazy soccer fans actually are and realize they can't treat them in the same orderly fashion that football fans follow. So definitely the event they need to have to get a wake up call on. Get ready for the Latinos coming and all the crazy football fans across the world to really shake things up in the US.
Now, to keep it related to stream time, Steve, you had a choice yesterday. Did you watch the game via BBC or via ITV? Which broadcast distributor did you choose?
Well, you might have seen something I wrote last week about whether ITV should be allowed to have the exclusive right to European Championships and World Cup finals so it can get the advertising revenue. But in the end, I was in the pub, so I didn't have a choice. So I watched BBC, and I enjoyed the commentary on BBC. I thought they did very well, and no one does a montage better than the BBC. So even through my sadness, I did admire the craftsmanship when I watched back on iPlayer.
How many ad breaks do they have, Steve, off the top of your head? Like, how often are they going to a break during the match? I haven't seen one match on ITV in years.
Well, I'm not sure, because I know that the number of commercial minutes in each hour of broadcast is limited to something like 10 minutes or something like that. So they fill their boots during half time, basically, because of course they can't go during the action. That would be ridiculous. So I'm not 100% sure on the current Ofcom regulations, but it's basically 3 ad breaks in half time. Obviously, the fact they extend these shows out for hours and hours before, because why wouldn't you? People will watch, even if it's not the peak audiences throughout. So yeah, the strict Ofcom rules, I think it's something like 10, 30 minutes. I can't remember. All I know is it's a lot less than Chris has to endure in the US.
That's for sure. I'm still wondering when we're going to get to a moment where they do more overlay advertising and allow that in football, because in the same way you have during NFL matches, having as they're about to hut the next ball for like 1st and 10, they might have a quick ad pop up for 10 seconds, and it would take away from some of the experience, obviously. But also, if that was a way to drive more revenue for some of these advertisers, and it doesn't really disrupt the game too much, if they can find the right moments, then it has to come at some stage, I would have thought.
I think that may alienate a few people on this side of the Atlantic. I think that could challenge.
Don't get me wrong. It would definitely alienate people, but we've seen what's happened with media rights revenues, right? We've seen across the industry that, particularly in Europe, they're struggling to make the financial returns on buying rights. So if someone was willing and able to drive another way of revenue out of those rights, we're seeing most of the VOD and the OTT platforms using a hybrid monetization approach now. If they were able to bring that even more to life, not go crazy, because particularly you could go real all in on this and lose half of a football match if you're not careful. But I just feel like there's something that has to be considered to potentially drive up revenue growth in that market, because of all the dependencies on media rights growth in that market. Otherwise, we're going to have this, not to get too dramatic, but things are going to break soon. Like the football industry is going to break soon with all the money, the spend for clubs to what they're getting in return on the bank that they're growing these teams' value year in, year out. That is going to fall flat sooner or later, surely.
I think that's where we're looking towards virtual advertising technology. I think that will be the area where we'll see a bit of innovation, a bit more organic creativity, rather than having a I don't think I can watch many more adverts for Bet365 as it is, although worth pointing out that football itself, there's a whistle-to-whistle ban on that side, but yeah, my goodness, there's a lot.
Well, if they can get anywhere close to the NFL and the Super Bowl and selling 30-second ads for £4 million a pop, they will find a way to do it. I think that just follow the money. And I think that would definitely sort things out.
Thank you for the BBC.
Thank you indeed. So for today's episode, I've selfishly taken control and decided to pick the topic because this is a momentous week for me. It has been nearly a decade, but I'm very excited to say that EA Sports, NIL, NCAA have finally sorted out their differences, and we are finally going to receive the return of NCAA football. It's been nearly 10 years since it last came out, and I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about the role of video games within sports. So we will talk a little bit about NCAA specifically coming back, but this is also why we brought you in today, Steve, because it is an interesting intersect with media. You know, it's not necessarily directly broadcast, but you'll get famous broadcasters are doing the audio commentary on the video games, the fans that are interested in it, and sort of where those things all sort of overlap within that. So today we're going to have a conversation about, you know, what the role video games plays with media, potential monetization opportunities outside of just selling the video games, and a little bit as well as what we've sort of seen in the esports space. It's something we've all kind of talked about for years and how it's developing. So I guess kind of the first place, just really quickly, Steve, from a business perspective, when we're talking about these video games, how does the licensing work for these, you know, with, you know, selling over your IP rights as a rights holder over to one of these developers?
Yeah, so I guess it's like any other licensing agreement. These deals give publishers or developers the rights to include athletes, teams, competitions in their games. The concept within sport dates back to the 1970s, and I believe the first instance was NASL Soccer in 1979 on the Mattel Intellivision, which I'm not going to lie, until a few years ago, I'd never heard of until I subscribed to Retro Gamer. So that's quite a niche proposition, but I'm led to believe people had them, and they were essentially get rich quick schemes. It was, you know, it was a new category of intellectual property that they could sell to someone in exchange for some direct revenue. Very little consideration was given to the quality of the product. It was video games; they're not important. They're for children. It's just it's a contract. Some money comes in, and it was a bit like Krusty the Clown in terms of what they would put their names to. If any Simpsons viewers out there, and there were some really obvious ones in terms of licensing. Like developers just love using licenses to, you know, as a marketing tool to get their games out in what was a crowded marketplace. Again, to use soccer as an example, we have EAFC and we have eFootball and a few other challenger titles. Back then, there were loads of games all vying for this, and so Pele had a game, and then there was inexplicable ones like Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona ! Which to this day, I still don't know what that is. I should really have looked it up. And the most notorious example of this was a game called World Cup Carnival, which was the official game of the 1986 World Cup. And the publishers realized that the game that they'd commissioned was terrible. So they basically bought another game that was released, I think, 2 years earlier, made a few cosmetic changes and hoped no one would notice, and they did. So it was not the industry's finest hour, but in the 1990s, things shifted a bit, and that was, I think, through, I guess, the wider commercialization of sports, certainly in Europe, but obviously in America, it went to another level. Games were a bit more mainstream. Technology was advanced. We had, in America, the console wars between Nintendo and Sega wasn't quite the same elsewhere. So it wasn't, for example, Sega was much more popular in the UK, and the home computers were also much more popular. The Spectrum and things like that. But it became a bit of a battleground, I think. And EA, who I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot today, they came in with NHL and Madden, and because John Madden, who at the time was pretty bigger than anything else in American football when he put his name on this thing, and he would only do it if he could help develop the game because he wanted it to be good. And I think that was a turning point for the industry as a whole in terms of how it created sports video games. And as things progressed, again, as technology became even more and more advanced, licensing became really important because people playing these games wanted the things to be as close as possible to the real thing. And when the graphics improved, it became noticeable if you didn't have the real kits, you didn't have the right branding. And there were once competing games, so there'd be NFL used to have multiple games, so it wasn't just Madden. There was NFL 2K, which was on the Dreamcast, and then because of the importance of licenses, and especially to EA, exclusivity became a thing. But now there's more of a recognition to meet different channels, to meet new audiences. Sony has Major League Baseball, but it can't just release it on PlayStation. It has to be on Xbox because it has to be on reach the widest audience as possible. The Premier League is also moving away from exclusivity. It now has, again, multiple categories, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. And even NFL, it's still got an exclusive simulation deal with EA, but it's also got VR games, it's got mobile games. It gets about reaching as many different audiences as possible, getting your name out there. And in terms of what's included in all these, it really depends. It depends on how centralized the license is. So NFL, that's everything. It's teams, stadiums, players, you name it. In football, again, it's a bit more fragmented in terms of leagues and clubs, but then also there's FIFA Pro, which is the union which controls the player names. So for a while it was possible to compete because you could still have player names, then change Manchester United to Man Red, or something like that. It's a lot more difficult now, and I think it's, again, it kind of points to why these things are becoming so valuable. And it again, for example, some clubs might have deals with Konami, but they might have a league deal with EA, which means they can appear in both games. So it's all very, very mishmashy, and I think we're seeing into the competitive landscape, licensing it's just becoming so important to the publishers, and it's becoming a more lucrative source of revenue for the sports industry.
One of the things I was curious on with these types of licensing deals now is, the sports industry has been built on licensing deals for since the sports industry effectively began. Now, these licensing deals are getting more and more complex in many ways, kind of mirroring the growth, the changes we've seen in the media industry with media rights deals, and getting much more complicated and more segmented and so forth. Do you have any sense of what the typical deal looks like? I'm guessing there's an element of minimum guarantees up front and then some revenue share or something along the lines for those types of deals. Obviously, every deal can be different, but do you have a sense of what a typical licensing deal looks like in the gaming space?
Again, it would depend on the size of the property, right? So I think if you've got more weight in the space, you can probably demand royalties. Particularly if title sponsorship. Whereas another deal might be just all up front. This is just, you get your guaranteed revenue, and that's it. But again, coming back to how these things have evolved from just to contracts to partnerships, there's more intangible elements of that, or even it's much easier to track the success or the relative contribution of a IP holder to the success of the product. So it'll be a case by case basis. It will depend how much leverage the property has, how important it is to sales. So, for example, I'm going to use again, let's come back to football again and EAFC. Like, for example, the Premier League is quite obviously going to have a demonstrable factor in that. But something like and I hate to say it, the Swiss Super League might not necessarily, but it might help flesh out Ultimate Team. It's also more teams, it's more authenticity, but whether that has the inclusion of Swiss Super League has much of a impact beyond its home market, who knows? So I don't have intimate knowledge of those deals, but I imagine it depends on the dynamic between the publisher and the IP holder.
So one of the things I found a bit interesting, I know you're going to talk in a little bit more detail about it, is sort of there's the leagues, but then there's also the players. And for me, that's sort of the whole reason the whole NCAA discussion has come up, and why I'm so excited about it is sort of the presence of NIL now. And I remember when I wrote my master's dissertation, I had a lot of people telling me I was crazy because I was pro player, players should get paid. But a large reason why NCAA started, and this was actually after my dissertation, but there was a court case basically saying that NCAA EA Sports were using the likeness of these athletes, but then they weren't being compensated for it. It used to be back in the day, the video game, if we're thinking Reggie Bush, famously having issues with the NCAA, it was just running back at USC, number 5, and he just so happened to be the same size, same height, same weight, same similar skill sets. And eventually the players did win to say that that EA Sports was using their likeness without paying for them. But at the time, pre-NIL, no one was able to get paid. So EA just stop producing the game. And now recently, in the last couple of years with NIL being out, they've been able to re-engage these conversations. Now, I don't think the players are necessarily getting that much money, but it is the reason why we finally got into this opportunity that we can bring the game back. But I also know FIFA Pro, from a player's perspective within European football, have had a similar issue. So I'm not quite as familiar with that case, but maybe Steve, just provide a little bit of background, sort of, you're talking about how multifaceted it is. It's not always just about the rights holders, but there's also the athletes sort of getting compensated on their end as well.
Yeah, so FIFA Pro is the global players union, and so if you're a professional footballer, you become a member of that, and part of that relationship includes image rights and at least using your name in certain products. And it came to a head because Zlatan Ibrahimovic basically was wondering, why am I in this game? Why is my image in this game? I don't remember signing up for this. And whether he did know that, or he was just trying to extract some additional royalties. And he posted about this on social media, and he got a bit of traction from other players who thought they should be compensated more effectively, and that it didn't quite have the same impact as NCAA, because I think it also kind of got caught up in the wider licensing discussions. Because if you're a current player and you're kicking off about you wanting more money to appear in the game when your club and your league has signed a very lucrative deal for you to appear in this game, I don't think that was looked upon favorably. And again, it comes back to that fragmented nature. Of course, NCAA, as you mentioned, is probably the ultimate fragmented deal, given there was no structure in place for those games to really exist. So it wasn't quite the same. But again, it comes back to who do you have agreements with? How do you make sure that all the elements are present? And I guess that's why these publishers now have extensive teams dealing with this. It's a long time since the deal for the first FIFA was allegedly agreed over one dinner on a bit of tissue paper.
Well, it's interesting talking about FIFA because it wasn't too long ago that they recently ended their 30-year relationship with EA from a video game perspective. And I guess it'd just be kind of interesting, what are the financial implications of that? Because I know part of this was FIFA's move to FIFA Plus to have this sort of digital ecosystem, and they wanted to have more ownership. But my understanding, it was about $30 million a year was that annual IP licensing. So from a business perspective, is FIFA ever going to be able to make up that difference in 30 million, or just how that relationship sort of is going to impact FIFA and some of its potential business income?
In a word, no, I don't think so, or at least not without a significant amount of effort. And I think that deal was one of the best in the sports industry that FIFA had. They got a lot of money for doing very little and received a lot of benefits from that relationship. I think we've discussed this before, and there's also arguably no other sports organization in the world that I guess believes that it should have more revenue, or has ideas of its station in terms of the revenue that it should have than FIFA. We've seen it in a few other instances now, and I don't know if it's just why it's a bubble effectively. And I can't remember the exact amount it was worth a year, but I think the last contract was worth, I think, a total of $500 million over the lifetime of that contract. That's a lot of money. And if you believe what you read, and I've not had this confirmed personally, FIFA's looking for double that. And it basically got to the point where you're like, we don't think we need this anymore. For lots of people, FIFA was a video game. It wasn't it wasn't a governing body. And over the years, EA developed this own community. They had a lot of data. People knew EA Sports was creating this game, and if you take away the FIFA brand, you're kind of losing a title, and you're losing maybe the World Cup every 4 years, and you're losing, I guess, just being in that inner circle. But then you have all these other agreements in place, so that's what basically was the crux of it. I like what FIFA's done since. I think it's made a couple of really shrewd moves since, and I think part of that is through the freedoms they've acquired by splitting with EA. Whether it will ever be enough to make up for that loss of income, I'm extremely doubtful. Although it is believed to be close to a deal with 2K Sports to create a new simulation, which Gianni Infantino a year ago said that it will be the best game ever. There was only one FIFA game. I'm not sure he had any idea of who he was going to be working with at that point, but they'll still make some money from it. They'll still get up. They'll still have some really interesting ventures on that. Again, as you mentioned, they are going more direct to consumer. They're trying to nurture those direct fan relationships. Games are a really important way and a really effective way of doing that. So it will probably still have a successful strategy, but I don't think missing out on the best deal in sports and sort of talking yourself out of it is ever going to be a good idea that will help offset those gains.
Just Steve, what was you mentioned that you like some of the moves that FIFA have made. Just what have some of those been that you can point to that you think have been smart moves since that announcement that they were going to separate from EA?
I think some of their mobile games and online gaming has been quite interesting, but the main thing has been the partnerships with Rocket League and Sports Interactive. So Rocket League, there's no easy way to describe Rocket League more than it's football with cars. And it's an incrringly influential
rocket cars. I think it's probably
they are rocket propelled vehicles. So. Yes, we're going to get really technical, and I'm rubbish at it, by the way. And I've been playing for the best part of 10 years. It's genuinely almost. It's really like it's like a sport in itself. Again, it's like an esport in itself, and it's got Rocket League, which is owned by Epic Games. They've worked with a lot of sports organizations to get their brands in their game, whether it's through car designs for specific teams, cross-promotion activities. And so the next FIFA World Cup is going to be based on Rocket League. And I think that's just a really good move when you consider that a lot of the esports that people follow aren't necessarily linked to actual sports. And it's things like League of Legends, it's Dota, it's things that just there's no link at all. Whereas this is an ability, I guess, to foster those links and be present in a different space, promote itself more effectively. I think the deal with Football Manager is, again, similarly, that's a really engaged football fan base. It helps create, I guess, another legitimate form of esport as well. I know Sports Interactive have been trying to push to become more of Football Manager to become more of an esport in its own right. I think it's a really, really good move. Plays into that. Football fans are now increasingly, I guess, tactically literate. They're interested in statistics and what have you. This way, you get to tap into that and you get to be at the center of it. I think it's a really good move, and one I'm a little bit surprised has taken this long to happen. But again, that could be because their deal with with EA Sports meant they weren't able to do this.
So that leads us sort of kind of in the next wave of questions, going from the kind of the business side into sort of the fan engagement side in terms of how rights holders can leverage their IP to develop a community. Because as you say, FIFA has a community of its own, Madden is a community on its own, but how does a rights holder go from having this community with one of their video games and driving that into other things that they do, perhaps driving it towards the broadcast side of their business or potentially into merchandise? I get that's a big, bold question. I suppose maybe you can dive in where you want, or I can see Nick's keen to jump in there, but moving towards that element of things.
I can just jump in quickly. I would just say, I think it comes down to who owns their actual relationship there. When you're seeing these licensing deals, ultimately EA really had the relationship with customers, and that's what the FIFA was being paid for. Can you find a way, and can you create an agreement? I think if you're looking at licensing deals moving forward, because back then those types of deals wouldn't have been in play, where you're really thinking about data. You would be thinking about how do you get as many people consuming stuff as possible and make the most money, and that was kind of it. Now that data play is a really interesting piece of the puzzle, where I think we're still trying to work out how to get value out of data and audience data for users, consumers, etc. of a sport. Now, I think that I'd imagine most of the gaming titles that now come around, whenever possible, that will be one of the key negotiation points about what access and information can they have about the users. Is it first party? Is it just third party? Is it just demographics only? What insight will they get? Do you need first party data anymore? Comes back to that sort of question about what's happening around the data play now and what's happening with Google giving access. So I just think it's a really good question to have about what they can and can't do, but ultimately who owns that audience, who owns that relationship. And in FIFA's instance, I'm pretty sure they did not own any of that relationship at all. That was in the hands of EA. But I might be wrong. Steve might tell us if that's off the mark, but ultimately their EA can just flip the switch, change the brand, and make sure they keep doubling down on who's already engaging with their title, and they don't miss it. They don't miss a beat.
I'm going to take it back a step just before we get to that point, and in terms of how you create that community, again, it comes back to something that I think we all hear a lot about, how you extend that relationship with your fan beyond the live event. And games, people play games all the time. It's some, we've seen there's reports that people play games while they're watching sport, and so you can engage them every day of the week. It doesn't matter what event is on. And then in the era of always online consoles, there's a lot of data out there. You can see how people are playing, what they're doing, which teams they are that they're playing as, and how they're interacting with the sport. And again, to come to your point, Nick, at some point in the last 15, 16 years, the first time you logged on to FIFA or to Madden, it would ask you to log in, give you details, and also include, I guess, what team you support. That's all really, it's a very small data point, but that's incredibly useful. I think those conversations just weren't happening 20 years ago, partly because games aren't what they are now in terms of engagement opportunity, and also partly because the technology wasn't there. And as you say, it all depends on how granular the data that a publisher can provide the property with. I guess that will come down to the agreement. And in the EA FIFA instance, it was basically FIFA asking for more money, more power in terms of that relationship, and not giving EA the concessions that it wanted in terms of how it wanted to extend into other forms of gaming. So that will be part of the contract. I'd be shocked if there isn't at least some degree of insight in how I guess individual fans behave and what that means to the property in terms of how it can sell, as Chris says, merchandise, ticketing, subscriptions to streaming services. And of course, with modern consoles, a lot large of this can all be done on one device. Some games even have live clips within the actual game themselves. So it's all a much more connected ecosystem, and you can engage that community. You can offer them special offers. You can meet them on through notifications. In many ways, we're talking about these platforms, these online platforms that properties always want their fans to exist on. Turning streaming platforms into genuine sports platforms. Video games are kind of already doing that.
One example I will call out, Steve, because we've just had the Wimbledon final this weekend, is the return of Topspin 2K25. Now, I'm not a big tennis fan, but I do know tennis, probably like some other sports like golf, might have a bit of a different age demographic to some other sports. But what's your takeaway from what you've seen with that in terms of engaging a younger audience, or particularly how Wimbledon and tennis is approaching this video game to getting a new younger audience?
I think virtually every sport and every sporting property should want to be on a video game. They should want to have their brand out there. They should want to have a way to reach these fans. I think part of the challenge is the cost of development. So again, 15 years ago, there were lots of tennis simulation games out there that looked quite realistic, played quite well. To do that in the modern era is quite difficult. You've got to have a lot of development. You've got to have a lot of marketing budget to create something that looks as good as what EA can do with the EAFC. And I think that's why there's not been a proper, real sort of, I'm going to call it, blue chip tennis game in 14 years. There's been a couple of attempts to do it, and there's been arcade titles, but Topspin 2K25, which is, again, backed by 2K Sports, that's a new opportunity for Wimbledon. That's something they alluded to the other week when I was there to cover the tech they're going to be they were doing over the last fortnight. I think something like Wimbledon, I think is probably all right in terms of how it reaches new audiences, because it's got so many other tools. But other tournaments might find a challenge. It's also building up player profiles. So what Wimbledon's been able to do with its first ever esports champs, again, that's something it wasn't able to do. It'll be able to reach a new audience and explain the traditions and the heritage of Wimbledon. Topspin, by all account, that's also a fun game to play, which also helps a lot. So it's just about making sure that these properties are able to send their message to a new audience, make sure keep on renewing that fan base. I think it's a step in the right direction. The one thing about Wimbledon is it always likes to, I guess, it prides its reputation above direct financial gain, so it wouldn't give its license to a game that was subpar. I'm trying to think of official licensed Wimbledon games, and I can think of about 3 or 4 over the last 20 years. So it needs a game that it's willing to put its badge on, and it needs a partner that's going to be able to create that community that we spoke of to reach those audiences.
So you mentioned every sport should aim to want to have a video game. You mentioned in our little preamble before this, you and I talking, that World Rugby was an example of someone that should really be doing more with video games. I mean, maybe perhaps using them as the example, what people should be striving to do, and why something like rugby stands out, and what other sports are maybe in that similar bucket that could, maybe they don't have something established like the NFL has with Madden, or football with the AFC, whoever that might be.
Yeah, so I think there's a case for some sports to part fund development and give their IP not necessarily away, but certainly have agreements like Nick was talking about, making sure they've got access to the data to a publisher. It's better for them to be part of something than without. You don't want to undervalue your rights, right? You don't want to give it away and no one thinks it's worth paying for. But so you should definitely get something in return. But the thing about rugby is, and we're using them as the example, rugby is a global sport, but it's limited to very specific markets. It's not a huge global fan base, and it's been really difficult for rugby to have a proper game. I also think no one's quite cracked yet digitally to make it actually fun to play. There've been a few that are pretty good, but it doesn't translate as well as NFL or football. And the other issue,
the rugby league game is quite good, Steve. I've played that one a bit, but it's an easier game to think about how it plays, right? You just take a tackle and you pass the ball out. Whereas I can't imagine Union just doesn't quite work in the same way for a video game experience.
No one's managed to do mauls, rucks, and scrums and make them fun. That's been the main challenge. Yeah, the Rugby League Live series is a good example, and it was the point I was going to make there. They've got you've got a core market there in Australia and a secondary market in the UK with rugby union. It's the only countries it's the major sport are countries with small populations. So New Zealand, South Africa, at least people interested in sport. South Africa, England. It's also it's a small rugby population comparative to the overall population. So you get this weird situation where the commentators are Australian. It's not quite global. There's not quite the licensing. The other thing is the most developed commercial market for rugby is France. So you can't really have French commentary for someone in Wales. So there needs to be someone who needs to sit in the middle of this, bring everything together. Licensing, developers, and have a progressive commercial agreement where they get data, there's royalties, and I'm not saying make it a loss leader because I think that's impractical, but you certainly shouldn't have profit as the main driver of this. And if you look at World Rugby, that's been doing Rugby Pass TV, again, it's similar to what FIFA's been doing with FIFA Plus, building those direct relationships. So why can't gaming be a part of this? You can have mobile titles. They already do some good work on fantasy. So again, it's just rethinking that relationship in terms of what you want from a deal. You don't want just money from it. And I'm just going to do a brief anecdote here about Australia. So years ago, there was a official game for the Gaelic Athletic Association. There was hurling and there was football. The only developers they could think of to create this were the people that developed the AFL games because of the similarities in it, and the people working on it had no clue about GAA, it's interesting how these geographies and economies of video game development work. Those were just similar games that were created by the same team without a in-depth knowledge of the sport.
So one of the things we've talked a little bit about is esports themselves. And I remember when I actually first joined the company, Nick, I said I knew about the sports industry. In retrospect, 5 years looking back, I knew absolutely nothing about sports. And I remember you asking me, any ideas on what event we should host something on? At the time, I said esports, probably because it was one of the first things that came up on Google. But nonetheless, we've sort of been talking about esports seemingly for quite a bit of time now. And we've seen things like the NBA 2K League. FIFA's got their E-World Cup that they take place. Madden's got its own league. Where do you think, Steve, that esports, and we'll try to avoid some of the, League of Legends or non-sporting events, but try to keep it within our realm of sports here. Where do you think that potentially can grow to? I know our colleague Ed Dixon wrote a very large piece about, the world champions for gaming taking place in Saudi Arabia at the moment and the amount of money that they're pumping into it. Can esports be a viable option in the sports space, or is it going to continue to be something that's maybe a little bit on the periphery?
Yeah, I mean, talking of fragmented landscapes, esports. So as you mentioned, there's a difference between, I'm going to say, the popular esports like League of Legends that generate these massive crowds. They're franchises and sports in their own right, completely different audience. The role of sport with esports, I think, is going to be twofold. It's going to be using digital representations of real sports to engage fans and build that audience, and it's also going to be interacting with the world of esports and bringing and perhaps expanding that way. So clubs have, I think Manchester City have an official Fortnite player. They're trying to tap into that fandom, bring people in that way. But I think it's in sports' interest to create their own formats and one that they control, ones that there's a direct correlation between the two. So, sure, if you have a professional Fortnite player and they're very popular among a certain audience and they become fans of Manchester City, but they're not really interested in football, I'm not sure how useful that is. But if you have someone who's really interested in EAFC and their favourite their favourite esports athletes are signed up to Manchester City, that's great. You might even interact more with Manchester City as a result. You might watch some more real football. I just think it's something that cannot be ignored in terms of an engagement channel, in terms of fostering that future fandom. And I mean, that's why I think FIFA's deal with Rocket League is actually really interesting, because it's sort of half and half. That one, there's demonstrable sports similarities, but it's not really sport. It's something that's perhaps not important right now, but it's something I think that leagues definitely should be thinking about. I definitely think federations should be, and clubs should start to be thinking about what they can do.
When I think about the role and the way that sports has approached esports, we've all celebrated. I think I won't put words in your collective mouths, but definitely in mine, that celebrated the approach, the idea that the NBA 2K League was trying to take by really building a destination, a title, set of franchises to build, I guess, quite a fairly seamless relationship between the 2K players and the league itself. But even what we've seen there is, when you have a great idea, what happens is that everyone jumps on board, more money gets thrown into the mix, and then what's inevitably happened with all this investment that the league took in terms of building franchises, the expectations skyrocketed and soared of getting financial returns and seeing incredible growth once a league was launched. Well, now I think the reports are that the CEO has basically fired everybody on the staff. I think they're going to start from scratch again for the league. Coaches for the teams have been let go, and it's all a bit of an absolute mess. I remember Ted Leonsis has made some comments initially about how big esports, and particularly on the sports related esports, was going to be, and they were all in on it, and that's why Monumental was funding that, investing into that approach. Ultimately, I think these things are great if they're managed. The expectations are managed, that it doesn't get over leveraged. And constantly, when we see something exciting, everyone jumps on board, throws a lot of money at it. Expectations go crazy. And even if the idea is great, even if it's achieving a set of objectives of building engagement with a new set of fan bases, a new group of people that you can't engage with, generating some reasonable revenue, it may never be enough to fund all of this money that's been come in and keep all the new stakeholders and investors happy. And that's ultimately what your point before, Steve, about the league or the property really being part of the decision making and about the development of the product and being all in sync and all together, I think makes a lot of sense. It just has to be continually managed. Let's not be too crazy about our expectations about this being a multi-billion-dollar business. We're all going to get rich off it. Let's just make sure it's one piece of the bigger pie. And if you manage it well, it can be a really valuable bigger piece of engagement for new audiences. Otherwise, the risks, you get it wrong, are pretty substantial.
Yeah, I think it's a real shame what's happened with the NBA 2K League, just for all the reasons you mentioned. And again, that should have been an audience that should have been ripe for this, right? Like, it's young, technically progressive, likely to be interested, and it should have worked, and it could, it still probably will work. It's just the minute you get this isn't exclusive to esports, it's exclusive to so many properties we've seen. The minute you get outside investment, or the minute you have people trying to build up teams, and the ambitions of it go beyond pure sport or pure, the idea for the betterment of the whole thing. It's about everyone getting their own piece of the pie rather than growing the pie.
Well, I think one of the other things, just anecdotally, personally, video games are supposed to be fun. Like, there's definitely an element if you want to beat your mates and all that, but there's the question of, sometimes does everything need to be professionalized? Does everything need to go to that degree? Obviously, they're taking the bet that it can do, but sometimes it's sort of, do you need to tap into the other side, the fun side, the community side? Because I think of people like a Ninja, something like that. Like, yeah, he's a good video gamer, but that's not why he gets, billions of subscribers. There's also, the community aspect of that. But then, Ninja on the other side can go on Amazon or it's NFL. I can't remember who he is, and he's an alternative commentary. And there's a way to kind of directly link that video game side directly kind of into the actual broadcast of the sports itself.
I think one interesting, I guess, source of conflict we might see in the coming years is the Olympic esports World Series. I think how, the ideas of, the Olympic ideal in the hyper commercialized world of video games and influencers and the things in that world that aren't, they're all new and they're not. It's going to be hard to reconcile those. I think it's going to have to be done quite delicately, and that's going to be something that's going to take a while to develop. The framework for how that's going to work in practice, because the IOC is obsessed with youth at the minute. That's why it's got the created the Olympic channel. It's doing other digital activities. That's why it's got breaking, climbing, other new sports in the program. So I think there'll be a lot of people really interested to see how it's going to make that idea work in practice. And I think I'd be very shocked if we see esports in the actual Olympic Games at any point, though.
Yeah, that was always the rumor that it might pop up in the Olympics in sometime soon. I mean, the reality is the problem is the whole ecosystem of how even gaming is run and operated, and then the relationship they have with licensing through sports, is to get all these publishers to then be willing to give over the rights and have their visibility in the product. Everyone's going to have to put some money on the table or step away from some money at some stage rather than managing that relationship themselves. And that is always a really challenging predicament in this industry, which is so heavily leveraged with lots of complex licensing agreements to expect that can really happen. So I would never say never, but I just can't see how they can get there unless someone works out a way to come up with a whole new approach. The Saudi Arabia event and those types of things are something completely standalone that's not trying to lean into the box of the Olympic ideals and values and just be able to create this global event with a load of money to throw at people to make sure there's an incentive for those players to play in it. That's about all you need, really, and enough money going to the key stakeholders so they're all happy. That's the only way you can really build something that is equivalent to the esports Olympics, in my view.
I'm going to go a little off piece here, Steve, and ask you a question we didn't prep for, but I'm just thinking about it. Video games from a distribution perspective, Twitch is the primary platform that people are using, and then we're seeing the growth of Discord for those different communities. Is there anything you're seeing for anyone that, that's in the streaming space that sports could sort of learn from what's being done on Twitch? Because I know there's a while we talked about, could Twitch get involved in, live sports rights? That's never seemed to come about. But in terms of the actual distribution of video games from a monetization, live content, is there anything from there that sticks out to you at all?
I mean, I think it's one thing sport is already learning about is the interactivity and the personality-led broadcasts on things like Twitch. I mean, it's not for me. But these watch-alongs, I can't think of anything I'd rather do less than watch someone watch a match and tell me what's happening. But people love it. Like, I don't really, it's absolutely alien to me, and I've always regarded myself as someone quite in touch with tech and gaming culture. I think pre-lockdown, I think that was the end of it for me. But I think tapping into that culture is something that sport has to do. Look at Luke Littler, the greatest youth athlete in world sport.
It's not you mean them all. It's definitely Luke Littler.
It's definitely Luke Littler, but he's interested in Football Ultimate Team. There's a great clip of him walking on the stage and opening a pack on EAFC on someone's phone. He is involved in the whole streaming culture. He did an interview with the Times, or there's a feature of him in the Times beginning of this year, and they were talking to his publicist, and he's from Warrington in the northwest of the UK, which is the same place as a famous radio DJ called Chris Evans. Luke Littler said, "Who?" And he was going through all the newspaper interviews, but he was not excited because he wanted to meet some streamers later in the day. And his publicist said, he knows no one that we know, and we know no one that he knows. So that's the future of sport, that crossover. And that's something I think people are they are learning from. They're doing, there's rights holders giving their rights away for free to streaming platforms or certain creators rather, who, I think FIBA have been doing that in terms of, what they can do and create alternative formats. That's really innovative. Of course, FIBA's got more freedom to do that than someone like the FIFA. There's extensive rights agreements need to be unpicked, but maybe in the next cycle there's room for the maneuver in those. So yeah, I think one thing we are going to see is Discord as well become more of a platform for sport, particularly as we shift away from, I guess, all-purpose social media platforms. And that's something I know that the crypto community are already doing, things like So Rare. That's a big thing. So yeah, I think sport is learning from the big players, and it also helps that someone like Amazon Prime has Twitch, so they can do that directly with their own rights, as we've seen in the NFL. So yeah, I'm going to give credit where credit is due there. I think there are a lot of forward-looking people in the industry.
I think one of the things that's been interesting to reflect on is the power of any influencer, particularly a sports athlete influencer, and how some of the major name athletes, particularly the younger echelon athletes coming through various professional leagues, have they're gamers. They start streaming the games that they're playing, whether it's sports or non-sports, and they get insane streaming numbers and viewership numbers. And they're talking through their gaming, their experience, engaging with younger fans. Again, we harped on about it so much, but I'm going to keep doing it until we see some progress here about the importance of that athlete economy, that athlete creator economy here in gaming and esports. There's such a big opportunity there if they can just craft it the right way, that not just look straight to the numbers here of finances, but maybe there has to be a bit of value exchange going on. But hey, just working with each other here to try and maximize audiences, basically audiences across different platforms. And once you get an approach that works, then you can work out how to monetize it. But at the moment, we're always trying to find an instant model that can be monetized instantly. And I think leaning into these other creator economies, and it's helping to grow audiences, fan bases, and just reach generally for gaming titles and sports alike, there's just an opportunity to tap in there that everyone can win. If you're a streamer and an athlete, you're going to have a bigger audience on social media than those people that aren't, and they're going to be hyper engaged followers of you through your social channels. So just there's a lot of value exchange. It doesn't need just to be about a financial deal always happening to bring that to life, I think. And so I would expect or hope to see sports continue to lean, again, more ways of getting more value out of the athlete and giving more value to the athlete, and things like this for the younger generation, your Luke Littlers and alike. This is a great opportunity if they get it right.
Well, Lamine Yamal said if he wasn't a footballer, he'd be a streamer. So,
There you go. Yeah, I mean, it makes too much sense. And even you think from a branding opportunity, we've talked mostly about just like licensing, but from a branding perspective, there's ways I think for brands to get in there, particularly looking for Gen Z demographics that, maybe a traditional partnership doesn't line up, but something along the gaming, that's a new way to potentially get in there. I think, it's not exactly the same thing, but, Pizza Hut's got an official deal with Madden, so that it's the official Madden stadiums, the Pizza Hut, e-stadium and things like that. There's potentially, I think, ways to tie that in. I think Fortnite already does that with some different groups that it does partnerships with. And given you can only, sell, could you potentially have a virtual stadium where, the Emirates is still Arsenal, but, could you be in a world where there's a virtual stadium that's got a different name? I think it's potentially interesting where it could open up some gateways there as well.
I would add to that. I think just generally, or extending off of that, is the opportunity I alluded to it a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the idea of athletes perhaps even broadcasting live events or near live events through their own social channels, through on YouTube or alike. So if I'm running the 100-meter final at Paris, imagine the reach, an extended reach, an audience you'd be able to give if you gave Noah Lyles, I think is his name, if I remember correctly, the sprinter, gave him the keys to the live rights on platforms that can be monetized through traditional advertising, programmatic advertising like YouTube, and do some sort of rev share opportunity. There's an instant audience there. The broadcaster gets some money. The Olympic Committee gets some money, and the athlete gets some money. And I think, again, in this instance, you could have it, for example, a deal's done with, let's say, one of the titles, let's just say hypothetically NBA 2K, and as part of that, let's say Pizza Hut's the official pizza partner, and there's an ongoing extension of that. It's like, okay, athlete, let's say Bronny James, or if you want to use him as an example because he's a bit of a gamer, if you play this game and reference Pizza Hut somehow in there, we'll give you a cut of the deal we have with them. So rather than Bronny James having to do his own deals, you could just get a rev share going through the industry and filtering it. It's almost the same way like CPMs work, cost per thousands in advertising. If you give them an X amount of reach through a new streamer product, then the advertising partner might be able to extend more money to the other stakeholders that are giving them that audience. That's a bit like, and it's not tin hat, but it's like it's a bit out there. But I really believe that there's a way, if we can create a model for the industry where there can be a revenue share component by extending these rights rather than limiting these rights, then I really do everything everyone can win.
Well, maybe we'll wrap things up coming back to a little bit, but I do think you are, Nick, you're starting to see a little bit of what you're talking about there with the NIL deals in America, because they're not necessarily getting paid as players per se with a traditional contract. A lot of how they're getting paid is with partnerships. Now there's a lot of money that's coming in from school boosters and things like that, but I think potentially somewhere down the line, something like that could be the case with how you get maximizing the value out of those. But Steve, I appreciate you coming on. It was fun to talk about video games with you, and I'm certainly excited. For anyone that's curious to know, my wife is going to a wedding in Italy this weekend. So when NCAA releases Thursday night, she'll already be gone. She won't be back till Sunday. And other than the 8-hour shift I have to work on Friday, don't talk to me because I will be very busy playing NCAA for the first time in 10 years.
Chris, I'm really happy for you because I know lots of people are waiting for that game, including there's some people who've been updating the last version of NCAA football, which was released, I think, 2014, 2013. They're releasing with real player names, new stadiums and kits for the past decade. So I'm happy for you, but I think I'm happy for them even more if they don't have to do it.
Do you expect the NCAA game quickly here, Chris? Well, I don't know how much research you've done, but are you expecting it to be basically like almost a mirror of the NFL versions of the games, or are you expecting it to be a completely different experience somehow?
So interestingly, John Abraham, our CEO, asked me this question before. I think what NCAA is going to do is it's going to take, and using another set of video games, it is going to take the simulation that we all really enjoy with EAFC and combine it with the management you get from Football Manager and morph it into a single game, because you're still going to have the simulation, the gameplay on the pitch, but where NCAA, historically, their favorite game mode is Dynasty. You get to build your university team. You get to recruit high school players. And I've spent some time in depth in some of the features, but I think where it's really going to differentiate itself from Madden is it's going to take in some of those Football Manager-esque things with recruitment, building your coaching staff, where it's going to overlay the actual gameplay itself with a lot of those behind the scenes sort of manager things. So that's actually probably where I'll spend more of my time. I'll probably spend more time trying to recruit some 5-star to, Georgia Southern, where I think this is going to be the team that I'm going to choose to rebuild, than I will actually playing like games on the field.
Just to return to the licensing conversation, of course, since EA had the exclusive NFL license, they've had no competition. They've now got 2 development teams working on two games, so they've made their own competition more or less, in terms of feature build. So that's interesting.
I was just really hoping you'd be able to play in my career mode and live the life of a 5-star athlete at a university. You can choose when you go to class. You can have a lot, go to all the parties, have a great time, live the life of a scholarship uni student for a few years, and living the high life whilst earning all this NIL money, going to used car dealerships and getting some ambassadorial work done on, and then end up getting drafted in year 1 of the NFL draft. Maybe following a Johnny Manziel style career path would be an interesting one to follow.
Nick, you need the Sims. That's what you need.
Maybe that's it. Maybe I just want to live vicariously as now a 40 plus man looking to live my youth out again, living it through an NCAA game. By the way, if you haven't seen the Johnny Manziel documentary, you should see it. I didn't realize how much of a mess he was, but blimey. Have you guys seen it?
Watched it recently on a flight.
Yeah, were you aware of Chris how bad it was for him? How bad, like behind the scenes, how bad it all was? As someone who's our token American.
I had an idea. The thing that was a surprise to me, though, was there was always a story his dad was big into oil money, and that's where his money was. So I knew some of the off the field party stuff was definitely as bad as what it kind of came out to be, but the stuff that was all made up to sort of like be a cover up, that was something that was totally new to me that I didn't know, because I always assumed he just came from oil money. So that part was the part that really surprised me.
Could you imagine if he was in the NIL era? My gosh, it would be carnage. But anyway, that's something. So I can expect to see a few more of those stories pop up in the coming years, I think, with NIL rampant across the industry.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for this episode, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Stream Timers. Until next time.